We've been taught a comforting story about empire. The story says colonial powers conquered lands for glory, trade, and exploration. That they built railways, ports, and administrative systems that modernized the world. But behind that story sits a quieter and far more powerful tool of empire: currency. Money was not just a way to buy and sell goods. It was a weapon, a system designed to reorganize entire societies, extract wealth, and keep colonized populations dependent on distant powers. Once you understand how colonial powers manipulated currency systems, you start to see that conquest was only the beginning. The real control came later, through money. Let's start with one of the largest and most influential empires in history, the British Empire. When Britain expanded across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, it didn't just send soldiers and administrators. It sent bankers, financial planners, and monetary systems. These systems quietly reshaped entire economies. Before colonial rule, many regions operated with diverse local currencies and trade networks. In parts of Africa, people used cowrie shells, metal bars, or locally minted coins. In India, regional rulers issued their own currencies tied to local trade systems. These systems were not chaotic, as colonial officials often claimed. They were simply decentralized and adapted to local economies. But the empire had a problem. A decentralized currency system made extraction difficult. If Britain wanted taxes, resources, and labor to flow toward imperial centers like London, it needed a unified financial structure. So colonial administrators began replacing local currencies with imperial money. In India, the British introduced the rupee under centralized colonial control. Taxes had to be paid in this official currency. That might sound harmless, but it created a powerful economic pressure. Farmers who previously paid taxes with crops or local goods now needed rupees. And how do you get rupees? You had to enter the colonial economy. Farmers were forced to grow export crops like cotton, indigo, or opium instead of food for their own communities. They sold those crops to colonial merchants, received rupees, and then used those rupees to pay colonial taxes. The result was a system where local economies slowly transformed into resource pipelines feeding imperial industry. Currency became the invisible mechanism behind it all. A similar system unfolded under the control of the British East India Company. At first, the company arrived as a trading enterprise. But once it gained political power in India, it began restructuring financial systems to serve its own interests. The company standardized taxation and demanded payment in currency it controlled. This had a profound effect on rural populations. Communities that once relied on subsistence farming suddenly needed cash. To obtain it, they entered debt cycles with colonial lenders or shifted their agriculture toward export markets controlled by the company. In other words, currency policy reshaped the entire economic landscape. But Britain was far from the only empire using monetary control as a tool of dominance. Consider the policies of the French colonial empire in West Africa. France created a currency known as the CFA franc, which tied the economies of multiple African colonies directly to the French financial system. These colonies were required to store large portions of their monetary reserves in French banks. This arrangement effectively gave France enormous influence over the monetary policies of its colonies. Local governments had limited control over interest rates, exchange rates, or financial independence. Even decades after independence, the structure of this system continued shaping the economies of former colonies. It's one of the clearest examples of how colonial monetary systems can outlive colonial rule itself. But currency manipulation was not limited to taxation and trade. Sometimes it was used to force labor. One of the most brutal examples comes from the Congo Free State under King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold's regime demanded rubber quotas from Congolese communities. Instead of traditional exchange systems, colonial administrators introduced forced taxation payable only in colonial currency. Villagers who couldn't produce enough rubber to earn that currency faced punishment. The result was a horrifying cycle of forced labor and violence. Again, currency wasn't just a financial tool. It was a mechanism of control. Across colonial Africa, similar strategies appeared again and again. European powers imposed what historians call hut taxes or poll taxes. These taxes had to be paid in colonial currency, but most rural populations didn't use that currency in daily life. So how could they pay? They had to work for colonial employers, often in mines, plantations, or infrastructure projects built for imperial benefit. Currency systems effectively forced people into the colonial labor market. What looked like a simple tax policy was actually an economic trap. Meanwhile, colonial authorities controlled the supply of money itself. By regulating how much currency circulated in a colony, imperial governments could influence wages, prices, and trade flows. Too little money in circulation meant workers stayed poor and dependent. Too much money could create inflation that destabilized local markets. Colonial administrators carefully balanced these pressures to keep economies producing resources while preventing local wealth accumulation. This strategy wasn't unique to Africa or India. The Spanish Empire used similar tactics centuries earlier in Latin America. After conquering large parts of the Americas, Spain reorganized local economies around silver mining, especially in places like Potosi. Colonial authorities introduced monetary systems tied to silver coinage. Taxes and trade increasingly revolved around this imperial currency. Local populations were pushed into mining labor systems like the meter, which extracted massive quantities of silver. That silver then flowed across the Atlantic to Spain, fueling European trade and imperial power. The currency system ensured that wealth moved outward, from colony to empire. And that pattern repeated across the colonial world. In Southeast Asia, the Dutch Empire structured monetary systems around plantation production. Local farmers were forced to grow export crops like sugar and coffee under the cultivation system. Payments, taxes, and trade were all tied to colonial currency structures that ensured profits flowed to Amsterdam rather than local communities. By the 19th century, colonial monetary policy had become a refined tool of empire. Empires understood something powerful. Controlling currency meant controlling the entire economic ecosystem. Think about what money really represents. It's not just paper or coins. It's a claim on resources, labor, and production. If you control the currency, you control those claims. Colonial powers realized that once they reshaped monetary systems, physical control became easier to maintain. People worked within structures they couldn't escape. Taxes had to be paid. Debt had to be repaid. Trade had to use the official currency. And all of those systems ultimately led back to imperial institutions. But there was another layer to this strategy that's often overlooked. Currency systems didn't just extract wealth, they reshaped culture. When local economies became dependent on colonial money, traditional forms of exchange slowly disappeared. Communities that once relied on reciprocal trade, barter networks, or regional currencies found themselves integrated into global markets dominated by imperial powers. Over time, economic dependence turned into political dependence. Breaking free from colonial rule became far more difficult when entire economies were structured around external financial systems. Even after independence movements succeeded in the 20th century, many newly independent nations inherited monetary frameworks designed for extraction rather than development. That legacy still shapes global inequality today. Some countries continue to struggle with currencies tied to foreign reserves, debt structures built during colonial periods, or economic systems centered on exporting raw materials instead of building local industries. In other words, colonial currency systems created patterns that outlasted empire itself. But understanding this history reveals something important. Colonial domination wasn't sustained by military power alone. Armies could conquer territory, but currency systems controlled daily life. They determined how people worked, what crops they grew, where resources flowed, and who ultimately benefited from economic activity. Money became the quiet architecture of empire. And once you see that architecture, you begin to recognize how powerful financial systems really are. The lesson here isn't just historical. It's structural. Economic power often hides behind technical language, exchange rates, monetary policy, financial regulation. But those systems shape real outcomes for societies. They influence who prospers, who struggles, and where wealth ultimately accumulates. Colonial powers understood that centuries ago. They built monetary systems designed to serve imperial interests, and those systems became some of the most effective tools of control in history. Because while armies can force obedience for a time, financial systems can guide behavior for generations. And that's the deeper story of empire. Not just conquest, not just trade, but the strategic control of money itself. If this gave you a new perspective, make sure you hit subscribe. History isn't just about the past, it's about understanding the systems shaping the world today. And once you start seeing those systems clearly, you'll never look at money the same way again.